Good evening, readers. I'm Audrey Chapuis, the director of the American Library in Paris. It's my great pleasure to be with you for this edition of Evenings with an Author, sponsored by Grow at Annenberg. It's an honor to welcome back Fredrik Logevall in conversation with Charles Trueheart. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce the library to those of you who may be joining us for the first time. We are an independent nonprofit founded 100 years ago at the tail end of the First World War by supporters who believed in the power of books and cross-cultural conversations to sustain a more peaceful world. And today we are a lending library, a cultural center, and a welcoming landing place, both physical and virtual, for everyone interested in lifelong learning, connection, and of course, literature. So thank you so much to our members and our donors for supporting the mission of the library, and thank you all for being with us tonight. So now to introduce our esteemed speakers this evening is Programs Manager Catherine Aline.
Thank you, Audrey. Yes, I'm delighted to introduce both of our speakers this evening. So first up, Charles Trueheart was director of the American Library in Paris from 2007 to 2017, and he continues to oversee its annual book award. Most of his earlier career was in journalism, including 15 years at the Washington Post. Before joining the Post, Charlie was associate director of the Institute of Politics at Harvard University. His work has appeared in the Atlantic Monthly and the American Scholar, where he is a contributing editor. And our guest of honor this evening is Dr. Frederick Lojeva. He is Laurence D. Belfer Professor of International Affairs and Professor of History at Harvard University. A specialist on U.S. foreign relations history and modern international history, he is the author or editor of 9 books, most recently Embers of War, which won the Pulitzer Prize for History and the Francis Parkman Prize. Please join me in welcoming Fred and Charlie. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you, Catherine, and it's great to be with you again, Fred.
Pleasure to be with you.
Fred and I met when he received another prize for Embers of War, the American Library in Paris Book Award, in its very first year, and covering a subject, the French in Vietnam, a subject close to my heart. And we've had a chance to talk about that period and to get to know each other better in the years since. So it's a delight to be in front of a library audience and to be with you. Fred, I thought we might just start with the origins of this book about John F. Kennedy. What drew you to this subject? What drew you to biography? You've not written a biography before. What drew you to this man who only served 1,000 days as president? And we'll go from there with some other questions about how you approach the project.
Well, it's so good to be with you, Charlie, and to be back, and at least in a sense, at the library. I so enjoyed the previous visit with my wife for the prize, and then, as Charlie says, he and I here in Cambridge, I think exclusively in Cambridge, have had opportunities since then for conversations about our respective book projects, and it's just great to be with you. I think, Charlie, that biography is a genre that's always interested me. I think Danielle, my wife, will tell you that on any given day, you know, the stack of books next to the bed will include biographies. And I think that's been the case since I was really a kid. So there's probably some of that in this decision to pursue a biography, that I've just been interested in the genre, have wondered if I can bring my training as a historian to bear, and the two are different. We can talk a little bit about this if you or anybody else is interested about how to think about history and biography. And with respect to Kennedy, I think he's somebody I've written about in different contexts, especially with respect to Vietnam, as you know, Charlie, but more broadly, the Cold War. And he's always struck me as a consequential, fascinating figure. We have endless books on the Kennedys, needless to say, but what we don't have is a book of the type I'm trying here, which is a kind of large-scale life and times, as we call it, biography of this guy. Because let's remember, you know, he lived through this extraordinary period, 1917 to 1963, when the United States becomes first a great power in the true sense, and then becomes a superpower. Greatest power the world has ever seen in many respects. How does that happen? I thought there was a way to tell that story alongside the JFK story. And I think that's what led me to this.
Yeah. Just so our viewers know, you've published now the first of a 2-volume biography, which breaks off when Kennedy is not yet 40 years old. Can you tell us whether you always approached this as a 2-volume biography, or did you come to that decision after you got started? And what sorts of constraints did that pose? And what liberties did it give you?
That's a great question. It was a 1-volume work. In fact, I remember the early conversations with my editors and with my agent, in which I said with great confidence, there's a lot to do here. It'll be a fat book, which is maybe okay for presidential biography. It's one of the genres that can handle, size, but it'll be 1 volume because after all, this is a guy who only lived 46 years. I can do this in 1 volume. And it was relatively late, Charlie, that I began to think, maybe not. And I think the big thing for me in this conversion, if you will, was the realization that the wartime years, I have a whole section in this first volume, as you know, that is about really the period 1938 to 45. So it's when his father becomes ambassador to Britain and is an appeaser of the First Order, has his own presidential ambitions that are crushed by his failed tenure as ambassador. But that period from 38 to 45 was so rich. There was so much to do, also in terms of JFK's own maturation, his own service in the war in the South Pacific, that it became longer, that section. I totally loved writing that section. And I think at some point I thought, maybe we should talk about at least potentially doing this in 2 volumes, not more than 2, but 2. And so then the climactic moment was a 4-way phone conversation with people at Random House and with my agent and me, in which we said, what should we do? And I wanted them to speak first to this question. I didn't want them to be influenced per se by my views, even though I had already told my agent, I think we should do this in 2 volumes. But they felt, I don't know whether they had a sense of this already, but they felt, Charlie, that, yeah, let's do this in 2 volumes. I think what it does, to just go quickly to your second question, I think the constraint is that I can't tell it as one story, the beginning, the middle, and the end of a relatively short life. And there's a certain price to be paid for that. But it does give me an opportunity to go into greater detail on some of these important questions, and particularly because I wanted to do both the history of the era and the life of this man. It just seemed the way to go.
Let's go back to that period you just referred to, 38 to 45, where John F. Kennedy is maturing. He's beginning to see the world. He's thinking about things. He's writing an early book that grows out of his academic work. Can you kind of set the scene for what he was experiencing and maturing in this period?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I just thought this was totally fascinating to research. I learned so much that I didn't know, as helpful as the previous biographers were to me. I thought I came to see, especially at the Kennedy Library, which is really one of the crown jewels in our library system, presidential library system. I came to see just how much there was here. I think what, among other things, I came to see was that he was a more serious young man than I thought. He was a bit of a slacker. It's not necessarily the contradiction that one might think that it is, because I think when he put his mind to it, he really was deeply interested in world affairs. Let's remember that, he graduates from Harvard in 1940. And so the challenges of democracy, which is, by the way, a kind of lifelong interest of his, what's required of democratic leadership, how do you square your, shall we say, political ambitions your need to get elected and reelected, with your sense of what you think is actually best for the country. That's something I think he's interested in already here in the late 30s, just as the democracies are facing the Nazi threat, the threat from Japan. So I think we see that. We also see this emerging split, if you will. Maybe that's too strong. But the degree to which young JFK is willing to separate himself from his father, towering figure in the lives of all of his children, including Jack. But the degree to which Jack, unlike his older brother Joe Jr., who is the golden child in the family, Jack is willing to basically say to the old man, I don't agree with you about appeasement. I don't agree with you about the need for American preparedness. We might actually have to, isolationism might be an untenable position for the United States. That happens in this period, especially, I would say, 1940, 41. So that year before Pearl Harbor, you see this, I think, quite fascinating schism between the older Kennedy and Jack. And then finally, I will say that his own service in the South Pacific, in the Solomons, I suggest has a deep influence on who he becomes. Hardly unique in this respect. I suspect many of the young men who served in the war came back from the experience profoundly changed, and I think he did as well. It in a sense, I don't want to read too much. You don't want to read the history backwards, but it certainly set him on a trajectory. We can say that would ultimately lead him into the White House.
Yeah, and it's often, the story is often told that Jack Kennedy was thrust into the role he later followed when his brother was killed.
Yeah.
But I think you're suggesting that he had political ambitions and was calculating, even at a very young age, that it might be him, not his older brother, who would be the player. Is that true?
Yeah, I think it's exactly right. And he had arguably the great love of his life, at least until he met Jackie. Was a woman named Inga Arvad, a Danish former beauty queen, with an interesting past. She was a suspected Nazi spy. And so, in fact, her apartment was under surveillance by the FBI when she was seeing young Jack Kennedy. This is around the time of Pearl Harbor and in the months thereafter. And even in South Carolina, when the two of them were in hotel rooms together, the rooms were bugged and the FBI picked up on their conversations. And one of the things you hear in those conversations, in addition to some other things, is that they muse, the two of them, this is 1942, about Jack running for office. She even suggests, kind of tantalizingly, you might go all the way, right to the very top. This is 1942, 2 years before Joe Jr. is killed in the war. And there's other evidence, too, that I bring out in the book suggesting that this is something he thought about. It is nevertheless interesting to speculate. Suppose Joe Jr. comes back from the war alive. What does it mean for his younger brother's fortunes? We can't know. It's an interesting counterfactual. It's possible that he would have had to bide his time, that Joe had to get, first shot at political office. It's even conceivable that Jack Kennedy would have chosen a different career for himself. I suspect, however, that at some point, JFK, even if his brother survives, seeks political office himself. It was deeply in his blood. He was arguably better positioned for it than was Joe Jr. But we can't know.
Since you brought up Inga, I wonder if we can talk now a little bit about John F. Kennedy's character and the way it is displayed in his treatment of women, his reckless behavior, even understanding that until 1953 he's a single man. Some of this is pretty hair-raising. And I had the sense, maybe you will disagree, that in treating this subject as you do very thoroughly in this book, you did so with some distaste or some mixed feelings about it all. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I think I think you've put it well. It was not a part of the book that I relished writing about. And I can say to all of you right here, right now, that in volume 2, which I have yet to really write, I'm researching it now. It's a little bit difficult because the archives, of course, are shuttered. So I'm a little stymied. But in volume 2, I think it's going to be still more difficult because he's going to be rising, obviously, in political power. And that power differential is going to become, it seems to me, quite problematic, especially when he's in the White House and he carries on as he does. But even in volume 1, and even though, as you say, he's not married until 1953, so relatively late in volume 1, it was difficult in many ways. And, you know, one of the conclusions that I draw in the book, I alluded to this already, Charlie, is that he's able and willing to chart his own path, to come out from under his father's control on political questions, on career plans. He makes up his own mind. So therefore, I can't really fall back on the excuse, which you know, may have some truth to it, but that, oh, he gets this from the old man. That because Joe Sr. was cheating on Rose from the day they married or before, well, therefore, Jack is just following in his father's footsteps. Because Jack could have shown the same kind of independence here. And not everybody in that age, even if it was a kind of Mad Men era, not everybody cheated on their partners, their spouses, their wives in the way that he did. That said, it's quite clear in the evidence, there's lots of it, that Joe Sr. expected his sons to carry on in the way that he did, to view women as objects to be conquered, and that the boys learned that lesson. So there's certainly something to that here. Mm-hmm. What's interesting to me is that there were, and he tended to do that. There's no question that JFK objectified women in that way. There were exceptions in the sense that, you know, Inga, who we've talked about, he loved her for her intelligence. He could not get over the fact that she spoke so many languages. He had a tin ear for languages himself. He valued her opinion. He was, I think, envious of all of that she had experienced and all that she knew. And in the same way, I think Jackie was somebody he deeply respected. Nevertheless, both before the wedding, after the wedding, he cheated on her. One other point I'll make on this is that I think he was somebody who had empathetic understanding of other people, partly because of his own ailments. We haven't talked about the fact that he was so sick for much of his childhood, partly because of the family tragedies, losing siblings prematurely. But he was able, I think, to put himself in other people's shoes, which had important, by the way, effects during his presidency. Cuban Missile Crisis. I think one of the reasons we get a peaceful resolution to the crisis is because Kennedy insists to his advisors, we've got to put ourselves in Khrushchev's shoes. We've got to try to see things from his perspective. That's empathy. So there's a kind of intellectual empathy that I think he has, that I think is real, that I think will be important when he's president. And yet he seems to lack, Charlie, a kind of emotional empathy. I don't know if this distinction is helpful, or if a psychologist would set me straight that I'm not thinking about this the right way. But he doesn't seem to be able to put himself in Jackie's shoes when it comes to this part of his life. So that kind of empathy he seems to miss.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I have a question for you that may be of special interest to our European participants tonight. You told me a couple of months ago that this book on Kennedy had been especially well received in the UK, and maybe you have other evidence that, I don't know if it's appeared in translation in other languages yet, but there's been a lot of interest in Europe about Kennedy and about your book about Kennedy. What do you think is the draw for the European reader, and who is JFK to them? And maybe this is a chance in answering that question to pivot into your own personal life. That is to say that you were born in Sweden, and grew up a European before moving to Canada and eventually to the United States. Talk to us about that, if you would, please.
Yeah, it's really good. I think maybe I'll start with the UK dimension. I don't know that I have a good answer to this. Part of it is just simply the timing. As you know, Charlie, where book reviews appear and when they appear can matter a lot to a book's fortunes. And I think we got quite lucky in terms of the reviews we got in Britain, and also where and when they appeared. So that may be some explanation for this. But I also think some readers, at least, I don't know how many of them, but some people interested in the book may have known before picking it up that this was a fellow who was an Anglophile from a young age. It's actually one of the interesting things about him is that even as an Irish American, Irish Catholic, he developed, and I talk about this in the book, this affection, especially for upper class Brits, and liked the sort of sensibility that they had. I think he thought he himself had that kind of sensibility. He admired Winston Churchill from a very young age. He had a historian's kind of sensibility, and he was drawn especially to books as a kid that were about British statesmen and British history. So there's that as maybe also for the UK part of this story. And then of course, Britain is really important in Kennedy's life and in his administration. So that's the narrow answer to your question. But I think I'd be interested to know, Charlie, if you have a thought of this, given your long-term tenure in Paris, that there's something about Kennedy to which I think Europeans are drawn, that it's partly about the self-possession, the charm, that self-deprecating wit, the degree to which there's a certain reserve in JFK that I think comes through. Maybe they're partly drawn to him also because of Jackie and because of her sensibility and what she brings to the table. This package, if you will, of the Kennedys, I think is something that resonated with Europeans. I can tell you that even though I was born in the year that he was killed, so I have no personal memory, lots of photographs I have of my mother holding me as a baby, and she looks like Jackie Kennedy. So that style that Jackie had, I think, became universal for a lot of European women and women elsewhere. So there's that. Mm-hmm. And maybe we see a little bit of this with Barack Obama, that there's a certain, maybe it's also the youthful part of this, but that the coolness, I'm going out on a limb here, and I would like to hear if you have your own thoughts on this, given your own experience, but that something about the combination of a certain coolness that both Obama and Kennedy had, this youthful appeal that they had, the degree to which they were articulate. They put emphasis on oratory. All of that together is a formidable package, probably for any international sort of audience, and maybe especially for Europeans. But I don't know, would you speculate yourself on this point?
He was a kind of Jack Kennedy was a kind of European style president, who seemed to appeal to Americans too.
I think that's right. I think that's right, and I think one of the themes in the book and I think it'll be a theme in volume 2. This is going to be through the work, is a certain international sensibility that he had. As I said earlier, he was interested in Europe, interested in the world. He got that partly from his mother. We don't give enough credit to Rose Kennedy, I think, in terms of shaping the son, the young man that he became. But yeah, I think you're right. I think because of that international sensibility, he became the sort of politician who was in some ways kind of universal. I think it appealed to Europeans. It appealed to Americans, as you rightly point out, and that's at least part of what's going on. And maybe we should also make some nod to the assassination, which of course was captured on film, and so it plays on a kind of endless loop in our minds. I think not just Americans, but people everywhere. Maybe there's also, the terrible as it sounds, there's also the connection from Dallas.
Yeah. Kennedy, as a European style guy and a guy with a lot of interest and experience in Europe, do you think that created a kind of blind spot for him when it came to Vietnam, just to leap ahead of ourselves? Although it's worth pointing out, as we were saying a minute ago, that even as a very young congressman, he was interested enough in what was going on in Asia to have taken this trip that took him to Vietnam. Can we anticipate a little bit of the second volume by talking about Kennedy and the evolution of his thinking about this issue that would come to dominate his administration?
Yeah, I think we can. And there's a certain paradox, I think, Charlie, in thinking about Kennedy and European colonialism, and maybe in particular here, Indochina or Vietnam. And the paradox is this. He was a young congressman thinking about running for the Senate. In fact, had basically decided, if possible, that he would run for the Senate in '52 against Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who, as you say, took this trip in '51 to Indochina. So it's the midst of the French Indochina War. I mean, we are right now in the depth of it. This is when Graham Greene is beginning to write his extraordinary novel, The Quiet American, right in this period. In fact, I think the Kennedys, Jack, Bobby, and Patricia, were in the same hotel in Saigon that Graham Greene was in at the same time. I have this vision of them passing each other in the in the bar and giving a sup nod to one another, as we say. But even then, here's the paradox. Even then, it seems to me, Kennedy asked the right questions, saw through the expressions of French bravado, wondered, and we have good evidence for this, including in his diary, can any Western power ever defeat this revolution by military means? I don't think so. So that skepticism is there. I think it remains with him really to the end of his days. But, and here's the paradox, this same Kennedy as president, and you're writing about this, you know this story at least as well as I do, that he expands US involvement, especially in 1962, in a way that I think is really important. It's not the kind of escalation we see under LBJ, to be sure. And we could talk about what a surviving Kennedy would have done in Vietnam, but nevertheless, it's a significant increase in the American commitment. And so one task for me, I think, in volume 2, this is maybe one that you're dealing with in your book. How do we resolve this paradox? And I think at least part of it is domestic politics, that he believes, because Democrats are often feeling vulnerable to charges that they're soft on communism. He believes, I've got to at least try to see this thing through. We've had a commitment to Saigon from Eisenhower, even to some extent from before that, when it was still part of French Indochina. And I can't be the Democrat, in effect, who lets this go. But yeah, I think there is a certain blind spot, to go back to your question, that he struggles with and never fully resolves. And of course, it's still there when he dies.
Yeah. But he does go from the skepticism of the early 1950s and seeing that there's no way that we can avoid the fate of the French.
Yeah.
But by 1957, just after the end of your first volume, he's the one who's laying out the domino theory, who's saying this is the last chance we have to stop communism. He sounds like a pretty convinced Cold Warrior on that subject.
Yeah, no, he does. You make a really good point. 57, 58, 59, we see this. Of course, there's the fact that No Dinh Diem, the leader in Saigon, is a fellow Catholic. That figures into this story. But here, too, there's a sort of paradox, because as you know, he gives an amazing speech on the floor of the Senate in 1957, castigating the French for their policy on Algeria, suggesting that not only in Algeria, but elsewhere in the developing world, the United States needs to be on the right side of history. It needs to support these people. It can't simply be anti-communist. It's got to be, the US has to be for something. It needs to speak to people where they live. And so he's, again, showing, it seems to me, a rather sophisticated understanding of some of the dynamics in the Cold War. But as I think you're suggesting, doesn't seem quite prepared to put it into, to articulate that with respect to South Vietnam. And it's in part, again, because he's now running for president and he's being politically pretty shrewd, thinking, what do I need to get the nomination? And I certainly need to be a strong, staunch anti-communist. And then he gets himself into this predicament.
I want to switch it a little bit to you as a teacher and you and your students. Presumably you talk to them about this subject matter. And for people in college today, this was as long ago as Theodore Roosevelt was for us when we were growing up. And it does seem like a long time ago if you're 20 years old. Yeah. What kind of appreciation for Kennedy, or questions about Kennedy, or confusion about Kennedy do your students these days have? What are you learning from them about Kennedy?
It's so interesting. I think you're quite right. I'm always struck by this as I advance in years. That, as you say, this is the equivalent of say Teddy Roosevelt, or I don't know, U.S. entry into World War I or something. When I talk about the escalation in Vietnam, in many cases, I mean, these are very bright students that I'm teaching here. In many cases, I'm surprised by the depth of their knowledge. They will say to me, "Professor, I read Profiles in Courage, between junior and senior year in high school," or they'll have this pretty sophisticated understanding of him and his past and his role, his legacy, but not always. Quite often the students don't have much of a sense of who he was. I'm probably helped in terms of teaching them here, of all places, by the fact that he's an alumnus of this institution. So I can talk to them about JFK in Harvard Yard, in the house Winthrop in which he lived, and that they can make that connection. I can talk to them about his senior thesis, which was written under great stress. He barely got it in on time. They're interested in that. And you can make those connections. His brothers went here. His father is a graduate of Harvard. So there's that. They have a sense already coming in. All of them, I think, know about the assassination. If it's the only thing they know about John F. Kennedy, it's that, that he was killed. So maybe that on some level also gives them a particular interest in this. But I guess my point is I try to connect him to this place, to Harvard and to Cambridge. And that, I think, works. And then the other thing I do, not only with Kennedy, but with all previous presidents, Charlie, is I go straight to policy questions. So I try to get them interested, in this case, in Kennedy, by focusing, for example, on Vietnam. They know something about Vietnam. Maybe they'll take my class on the war, which I'm teaching right now, by the way. And if I can say to them, here's a guy who mattered, and here are the reasons why he mattered, we need to look at his policy decisions, then they can put a face to this really consequential foreign policy decision that the United States made, this intervention that went awry, and I can teach them about Kennedy that way.
Cool. One last thing I'd like you to talk about before we go to our questions from the audience, and I hope there'll be lots of them because I want to leave as much time as possible. Your book ends in 1956 at the Democratic Convention when, for a brief moment, there's a flurry of talk that John F. Kennedy might become Adlai Stevenson's running mate at a very young age, and John F. Kennedy shows himself to be an astute politician thinking on his feet. Can you describe that scene for us and remind people about that that never was moment?
I loved writing this section. I hope those of you who read the book, I hope that comes through on the page. I love myself when I can sense that an author is really excited about his or her topic. I was saying to somebody the other day that one of the things I love about, I think I said this to you also, Charlie, but one of the things I love about David Halberstam's book, The Best and the Brightest, is that, and I never had a chance to meet Halberstam. You just have this sense that no story in the world matters as much to David Halberstam as the one that he's telling in that book. It just sort of comes off the page. So I hope in my own little way that this story of the 1956 Democratic Convention in Chicago brings that through. I mean, it's just an amazing moment when he enters this convention relatively unknown. You know, activists and political junkies know about him, but really nobody else does. And he leaves the convention 4 or 5 days later as the bright new star of the Democratic Party. And it's because Stevenson decided to bring some pizzazz, some zip to the proceedings by opening up the selection of the vice presidential nominee to the convention. So what follows is an incredible, really dramatic contest that ultimately pits two of the contenders, Estes Kefauver and JFK, for this slot. And it looks like Kennedy's got it. And then at the 11th and a half hour, Kefauver sort of nips it at the end. Joe Kennedy is thinking and saying to Jack, using pretty colorful language, "You're an idiot for wanting to be the nominee because Stevenson's going to lose, no question. You're going to be blamed for this loss because you're a Catholic and you're too young and you're too inexperienced. Why on earth would you want to do this?" And here again, he defies the old man. He goes for this. He's really upset when he loses, but it turns out to be a great thing for him because he's not saddled with blame for the loss, which in fact happens in the fall. It's a landslide for Stevenson. I'm sorry, for Eisenhower against Stevenson. And yet he's emerged from this convention, I suggest in the last chapter, as a bright new star in the party. I think it sets him on his way. I think it's key to understanding why he's going to run in 1960. And so this volume, as you say, ends there, or it ends at Thanksgiving in Hyannisport, in a conversation between him and his father in which they basically decide we're doing this. And the last line of the book is from Jack. "Well, Dad, I guess the only question is, when do we start?" And so then the volume 2 will pick up from there. But the Chicago story is remarkable.
It's a great place to leave off. We can hardly wait to see what happens.
Well, you and me both.
Catherine, why don't you select some questions for Fred?
Happily. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you for that wonderful interview and for the questions that you've prepared. And thank you, Fred, to answering Charlie's questions. And yes, we'll move on now to the audience questions. So I've got a couple here right away, but just to formally invite everybody to submit questions, please do so in the chat and we will get through as many as time allows. So the first one here is from Sarah, who's written, to what extent do your students have a grasp of the Cold War, its historical origins and impact on policy decisions well beyond the 1950s for the US?
I think it's a really good question. And I would say they have a pretty good grasp of at least the basics of the Cold War, whether it's because of AP US history or more specialized courses that they maybe took in high school before coming here, or perhaps because they've taken another class here, maybe as freshmen or sophomores. But I've been impressed by and large with the knowledge they have about why the conflict happened, what was it that caused these former Grand Alliance partners, the Soviet Union and the United States, a few short years after the end of World War II, to now be locked in a Cold War. How did that come about? What are the main developments then in the roughly half century that follows, to the end, to the dissolution ultimately of the Soviet Union? I think they have a grasp of that, at least again in broad outline. What they don't have, and what I then try to provide through my own lectures, through our discussion in class, through the readings, is a deeper sense, and a sense of what the contingent elements were versus the more structural, the deeper causes of in terms of the outbreak of the conflict and then the course that it took. But it's a pretty impressive group of students, I will say, on many of these questions.
Okay, great, thank you. So the next one is from Donna here. What do you think is the influence of the charm and charisma, just lost it there, charm and charisma of both Jack and Jackie on his political life?
Well, I think it's considerable. I think that in life, that is to say, in the 1,000 days that they had together in the White House, I think it mattered enormously. Charlie and I talked a little bit about this earlier, and not just for American audiences, but global audiences. And Jackie, I don't think we should underestimate just how important she was to this. If you talk to the archivists at the Kennedy Library, as I do, they will say a common refrain, and this is something I'm going to deal with in volume 2. The common refrain is that Jackie doesn't get enough attention or enough credit for what she brought to the administration, to what she brought to the White House. And so I think that charisma, that charm, that glamour that they brought is considerable. And of course, we can mention here, especially since this is Paris, that the visit that they had to France in the spring of 1961, it's amazing the degree to which the French are, I think, attracted to them both, but how Jackie in particular, excuse me, makes this winning impression, in part because she speaks the language so well. So there's that, but I would also say that some of this, I suppose, is as a result of the circumstances and the timing of his death, that we attach special importance to what came to be known as Camelot. We attach special importance to the charisma and the charm that they brought because of the fact that he was killed, and that he was killed when he was and in the way he was. And again, as I said before, that it was captured on film, because he's kind of frozen in time for us. And in a way, so is she, even though, of course, she lived to be, she lived a good long life. I think that helps to account for this legacy and for how we think of the two of them together. I'll just say one more thing about this, which is the self-deprecating sense of humor that he had. It's almost impossible, I think, to exaggerate how important that was, and his ability to use it, especially in his press conferences, and how much that worked for him at the time, but also in terms of how we think of him today. Quite amazing.
Okay, great. I'm going to dive into one here that sort of follows up on similar lines, as well as gets into the visit to France that you had already mentioned. So this one's Vivian and Ben, and they write, Jackie famously facilitated the Kennedys' visit to France to meet de Gaulle. Can you speak to JFK's ability or inability to understand or promote Jackie's diplomatic power, especially as it pertains to France and its foreign policy?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think he was, and other people around him were, kind of skeptical about whether Jackie should be, how they should use Jackie, if I can put it that crudely, in terms of the 1960 election. Will she be an asset or not? It was pretty plain to everybody around John F. Kennedy that she didn't particularly like politics. She didn't like campaigning. She was of a certain, refined sensibility that maybe didn't translate so well to the campaign trail. So there were questions then, I think, in his mind and others about the degree to which she could be a political asset for him, if I can put it in those terms. By the time we get into the presidency, and certainly by the time we get to France on this extraordinary trip, I think he fully understands, wow, I've got somebody here in my spouse who is phenomenal at this, and who is hugely important for me. I think he saw it then, maybe for the first time, or at least he hadn't fully understood it until there they were. And she's charming de Gaulle, chatting with him in French, talking with journalists, and of course JFK famously quips, "I'm the gentleman who accompanied my wife to Paris," and so on. So I think it's fully demonstrated right there, and I think for the remainder of the presidency, notwithstanding marital strains, and those are real, and as I said earlier, I have to deal with those. I do think the marriage becomes better as time progresses. It becomes better toward the end. But politically, she is really important. And of course, she's an extremely intelligent woman. And sometimes that whispery voice of hers that was really an affectation could maybe suggest otherwise. But she was really sharp, shrewd in her own way, and a great asset for him politically.
Great, thank you for answering that so thoroughly. Okay, I'll take one from Carolyn now, who is writing, do you believe the format of the presidential debates between JFK and Nixon, the first ever televised in the US, played a role in JFK's win?
Yeah, it's good. Really looking forward to writing this part of the second volume. Yeah, I think the debates were really important. You could make a counter argument, which I'll make, and then I'll pick it apart a little bit. The counter argument is that the polls were really close before the first debate, and they were really close after the last debate. So there were four debates total between Kennedy and Nixon, and they got huge audiences. The audience dropped somewhat after the first one, but still really healthy for all of them. But you could say, well, how important could they be if in fact they were neck and neck before and they were neck and neck at the end? Well, that's a fair point. But I think what the debates did, which I think was ultimately important, showed a lot of Americans, including a lot of Democrats, who might have had some doubts, that this guy he's young, yes, but he's knowledgeable on the issues, sufficiently knowledgeable on the issues. He can think on his feet. He presents well. There's a sort of gravitas about this guy that I don't think would have been there without those debates. And conversely, Nixon, especially in the first debate, he recovers, especially in the third debate. But Nixon loses a certain ground, if you will, in the first debate. So they matter a lot. The margin of victory is so close in the end, as we all know. that any one of 12 different things could be seen as decisive. Whenever you have a really close outcome, there are lots of things you can point to. Same with Trump and Clinton in 2016, same with Biden and Trump in 2020. You can point to a lot of things when it's close. But I think to my mind, there's no question that the debates and JFK's preparation for the debates, he took them really seriously. And his performance in the debates mattered a lot. He was always quite good on his feet. This is one of the things I talk about in the first volume. He was good in this kind of setting anyway. And then add in his telegenic looks and his youthful bearing. It's a pretty formidable package.
Absolutely. All right. So just to balance it out from all these questions about charisma and strength, I'm going to pick one here on a slightly different angle. So how did health problems impact his daily life, and how was he able to pass a Navy physical?
Oh, yeah. Well, on the last one, I think this is where Joe Kennedy's help mattered. That Joe, even though it's ironic because he actually was desperate to keep his sons out of harm's way, did not want them to serve. This is one of the reasons why he was opposed to U.S. intervention in the war. Even after Neville Chamberlain, after the British basically abandoned appeasement, Joe Kennedy still holds to the idea, still is desperate for the United States or the West to make a deal with Hitler. But even so, when Jack makes clear, I want to enter the service, and I give Joe Kennedy credit for this, he helps make it happen. So there is a sort of physical of sorts, but it's not very serious. He initially has a desk job in Washington. That helps to get him into the Navy. That he has a job in naval intelligence to start with. So that helps, but it's his father. The health problems which are there from the time he's a toddler, they're really important, as they would be for anybody. He spends a lot of time in bed. I think they teach him that life is capricious. There's a certain fatalism that I think becomes part of his personality. Also, he loses several of his siblings. He loses Joe Jr. He loses the sibling to whom he feels closest, Kathleen, known as Kick. She dies in a plane crash. Rosemary, the sister who's closest to him in age, he effectively loses her to a botched lobotomy in late 1941. So the combination of his health problems and his tragedies, I think, give him a certain fatalistic outlook on life that I think is important. I'll say one other thing about the health. It's a bit of a contradiction, although maybe not, and I'll explain why. But it's interesting to me that this guy who was in pain most days of his life, nevertheless, during his campaigns, would go from the crack of dawn until midnight, day after day after day. His aides would become completely exhausted. He, I'm sure, was exhausted, but he would drive himself forward relentlessly in these campaigns, notwithstanding the pain. And I was thinking to myself, why would this happen? And I think, at least in part, it's that he's wanting to demonstrate to others, but also to himself, that he can surmount these health problems, that they won't, define him, and it makes him actually more determined to proceed, even though, as I say, he's in great pain much of the time, and I write about this. It's pretty interesting.
Great, thank you. Echo, you've got a real insider question here. I'm curious to know if you've written about this or know about it. And now is the time to ask. So I'm going to take this question from Emmy, who says, is it true that JFK agreed to an increase in forces, aka advisors, when he was in mourning over the loss of his son Patrick, and more or less blindsided one of his advisors to agree to the increase during a one-on-one phone call? Do you happen to know about that episode?
Well, I wonder if Emmy's talking about Vietnam when she says increase in forces, and Charlie may be able to speak to this. I don't know that that's that's certainly contrary to anything that I know. In fact, what he's entertaining is the possibility of a reduction in U.S. forces. I attach less importance to that reduction than some people do who see it as evidence that John F. Kennedy, before his death, had already decided to get out of Vietnam. I'm skeptical of that argument, and I've written about that. I think it's entirely possible that he had decided that he would never Americanize the war. But that's different from arguing that he had already commenced the withdrawal. So Patrick's death is late in the administration, and Charlie may or may not want to chime in on this. He's been researching some of this himself, but I'm not aware of any such agreement to increase forces.
Okay, Charlie.
And me neither. In fact, the thing on his mind when Patrick dies in August '63 is what he's going to do about the government in South Vietnam, and whether he's going to give the nod to a coup. Those are the issues on his mind.
That's right.
As well as the possibility of doing some symbolic withdrawals of forces.
Yeah, that's how I see it too.
Great, thank you both. And Emmy has replied that yes, that is exactly what she was curious about. So I think we have handled that question. Thanks. So I have a couple questions here. We probably can't avoid talking about this, although it's not in volume 1. People are curious to know your opinion on the assassination, of course. And I guess, okay, so people would just like you to share your viewpoint, and then maybe to broaden that, if that's not something you're most comfortable addressing, how do you plan to kind of tackle that episode?
Yeah, no, they're good questions. And as we draw to the end here, maybe we do need to say something about this. I need to do more research is the first part of my answer to this question. It's of course created a literature all to itself. The number of books that have been published dealing with the assassination is extraordinary. And so it spawned this enormous literature. And I need to grapple with this as I prepare for volume 2. I'm keeping an open mind as I delve deeper into this. The way I see it now is that Lee Harvey Oswald was the gunman and was the lone shooter. There are interesting questions about some of the associations that Oswald had, the meetings that he had, including in Mexico City in the weeks prior to the assassination. And one could make the argument, as some have, that there is evidence of some conspiracy there. That is to say, he may be the only shooter, but he may have coordinated with others in the lead up. Again, I need to delve further into that. Last thing maybe I'll say on this point is that my present inclination, we'll see if I change my mind about this, is not to go into heavy detail on this question. That the main narrative will end on November 22nd, 1963. I will have an epilogue where I talk about Kennedy's legacy, why does he matter for us today, what's his importance in history, including the role of television, obviously, and lots of things that we haven't talked about here. I think I owe my reader my thoughts on what happened in Dallas. So I will offer that. But I'm not at present planning to go into depth on this, the Warren Commission, all the rest of it. If anybody has thoughts on that, of course, they can let me know offline, as they say. But that's my thought now.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you for taking that one then as well. Unless Charlie had any concluding remarks before I wrap it up here. Nope, he's telling me no. This has been such a pleasure to host both of you. And thank you also to our audience for these wonderful questions. You've taken it right up to the hour here, so we've got to let everybody go. But I did want to remind everybody that the American Library in Paris is, of course, a nonprofit institution, as Audrey mentioned in the beginning of the program. We welcome donations of €10 per person per event, if that's something that that you're interested in doing, if you're interested in supporting our institution, please do visit that link that went out in the Zoom link email. It's just above sort of the Zoom link, and you can find out about more ways to support the library. We would very much appreciate it. Thank you to those of you in our audience who are donors or members, or even just joining us for the first time. It's been a real pleasure to spend the evening with you. And thank you also, of course, to our sponsor, Grow at Annenberg. And finally, to wrap it up, once again, thank you to Charles Trueheart and to Fredrik Logevall for being here with us this evening and for this wonderful conversation. We look forward to reading the book and, of course, to volume 2. I don't know if we have any indication when that will be out. I know you're still in the research phase, but knowing it will appear, I think, is a very exciting.
It will appear. I do need the archives to reopen, but thank you all. Special thanks to you and to Charlie, to Audrey. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening, everybody. Until next time.